After the funeral of the twin little sister, the stepmother expels the little girl who cries and pleads, "Why are you kicking me out, Mom? Do you hate me?" She intended to rid herself of the burden of having to care for the poor girl. But what she never expected was that the millionaire brother of her husband would arrive right at the moment of the cruel act. Seconds later, what he does leaves the current man and the stepmother in shock and much more. The air in the mansion still smelled of lilies and farewell, a sweet, heavy scent that clung to the dark velvet upholstery and the fabric of Clara's little black dress. At 8 years old, the world felt like a vast, empty ballroom, where the echo of a laugh that was almost hers, but wasn't, refused to fade. The funeral for Laura, her twin sister, had been a grand affair, marked by the silent luxury her father's money could buy, but devoid of any warmth that could touch her small, frozen soul. Now, back in the room she once shared with her other half, silence was her only companion. In her trembling hands, she clutched the small, framed photograph she had managed to discreetly slip from near the casket, a final portrait of the two of them smiling in matching dresses, the bows in their hair perfectly aligned. It was the only treasure she had left, a piece of a world that had been shattered in two. Her sobs were quiet, almost inaudible, for she had learned early on that her tears bothered Veronica, her stepmother. The bedroom door opened without a knock, and Veronica's slender figure filled the frame. Her eyes, an icy, clinical blue, held no sympathy, only a restrained impatience. She didn't approach to offer a hug or a word of comfort. Instead, she stood there, appraising the small figure huddled on the bed. For Veronica, mourning was a social performance, and the curtain had already fallen. Now, it was time to clear the stage. The stepmother was thinking of the future, a future free of attachments, where the vast fortune left by her husband, an estate built on shrewd investments and high-risk tech ventures, would be hers and her new partner's alone. The girl was an obstacle, a living reminder of a life she wanted to bury along with the other twin. To her, the child was a liability on her personal balance sheet, a barrier to unrestricted access to the inheritance and the assets that would yield generous returns for years to come. "Clara, get up," Veronica said, her voice smooth and devoid of emotion. "There are things that need to be dealt with." The girl obeyed, clutching the photograph to her chest. She followed her stepmother down the silent hallways, past family portraits that now seemed to belong to another life. They reached the entrance hall, where the polished marble floor reflected the weak afternoon light. Next to the imposing oak door, a small pink suitcase, the same one Clara used for vacation trips, sat on the floor. The girl's heart took flight, a frightened bird beating against her ribs. She didn't understand. Where were they going? Why was her suitcase there? Veronica's partner, a man with a smile that never reached his eyes, watched the scene from a distance, leaning against a pillar like a spectator, enjoying the unfolding of a well-executed plan. He saw it as the removal of the final obstacle to a fortune he never built, dreaming of the dollars and euros that would soon be in his hands. Veronica crouched down, but not for an embrace. She gripped Clara's thin shoulders with unnecessary force. "You can't stay here anymore, darling," she said, the word darling sounding like an insult. "I need a fresh start to find my peace. You understand, don't you? Your presence, it's too much of a reminder." The tears Clara had been holding back finally spilled over, hot and salty, streaming down her pale face. She looked at the woman who had once promised to love her like a daughter, then at the man watching with indifference, and finally at the pink suitcase on the floor. The door opened, revealing the grey, late-afternoon sky. Veronica pushed her gently but firmly outside. Placing the suitcase beside her on the cold pavement, the girl, in a state of shock and despair, turned and grabbed the hem of her stepmother's dress, her voice a trembling, pleading thread that cut through the silence of the affluent neighborhood. "Why are you kicking me out, Mummy? Do you hate me?" Clara's question, fragile and laden with a pain no child should ever know, hung in the heavy air, a whisper that seemed to freeze time. Veronica opened her mouth to reply, perhaps to spin another one of her cold lies, but the words died on her lips. A tall, imposing shadow fell over them, cast by a black luxury sedan that had pulled up silently to the curb. From the vehicle, a man with broad shoulders and serious features that mirrored Clara's father's stepped out. It was Richard, her late father's younger brother, a multi-millionaire whose fortune was built on a rare business acumen and a venture capital empire. He was returning from a business trip in Europe where he had been finalizing an expansion of his capital and had decided to stop by to check on his niece, driven by an uneasy feeling that had been nagging him for days. He had seen it all, the pink suitcase on the sidewalk, the subtle push, the girl's desperate plea. His face, normally calm and analytical, was a mask of contained fury. "Veronica!" His voice was low, but it carried an authority that made the stepmother stiffen. "What in the world is going on here?" For a second, panic flickered in Veronica's eyes, but she quickly reassembled her facade of the grieving widow. She stood up, smoothing down her expensive dress. "Richard, what a surprise. We were just saying goodbye. Clara is going to spend a few days with a school friend. A little change of scenery. You know, for her own good." Veronica's partner stepped forward, attempting a conspiratorial smile. "Exactly. We're just reorganizing the house to get through this difficult time." But Richard wasn't looking at them. His eyes were fixed on the small, trembling figure still clinging to the stepmother's dress. He saw the tear tracks on her smudged face, the total desolation in her eyes, and the way she cringed as if expecting a blow. The curtains in the neighboring windows shifted discreetly. The scene had not gone unnoticed. In this exclusive enclave, he knew reputation was everything, and Veronica's was about to be shattered. Ignoring their flimsy excuses, Richard took 2 long strides and knelt in front of Clara. His voice, when he spoke to her, lost all its harshness, becoming a haven of tenderness. "Clara, sweetie, what did she say to you?" The girl sobbed, unable to form words. Instead, she finally let go of Veronica's dress and threw herself into her uncle's arms, clinging to him with the force of a drowning person. The scent of expensive cologne and Richard's wool coat enveloped her, a scent of safety, of family. He hugged her tightly, feeling her small body shake against his. It was in that moment that all his rage surfaced, not in shouts, but in a glacial promise. He stood up, Clara still nestled in his arms, her face hidden in his neck. His eyes met Veronica's, and the contempt he felt was palpable. "Reorganizing," he repeated, the word dripping with sarcasm. "You throw her out on the street with a suitcase and you call that reorganizing? You were going to leave an 8-year-old child who just lost her sister and her father completely alone. You don't understand." Veronica hissed, her voice finally breaking, revealing the cruelty behind the mask. "I have to move on. This girl is a burden." The brutal confession echoed down the quiet street. Richard didn't even bother to reply. He turned and walked toward his car, with Clara held securely in his arms. He gently placed her on the soft leather seat and buckled her in. Before closing the door, he looked at Veronica one last time. She was now staring at him with a mixture of hatred and terror. "You're not getting rid of her. You're getting rid of me," he said, with a threatening calm. "And you will bitterly regret this day." He closed the door and walked around the car. Veronica, desperate at the sight of the inheritance and her comfortable future slipping through her fingers, ran toward him, her face contorted with fury. "You can't take her. She's my responsibility. You have no right." The word right left Veronica's lips like a desperate war cry. But Richard met it with the coldness of a steel wall. He didn't even turn to face her. With his hand on the handle of his car door, he replied, his voice a frigid murmur that traveled down the silent street and hit the stepmother with the force of a slap. Your right, Veronica, ended the moment you put a grieving child on your doorstep. The only right that matters now is hers, the right to be protected, to be loved, and I will ensure she has it, with the full weight of my name, my fortune, and the best lawyers money can buy. He got into the car and shut the door with a soft but final click that sealed Veronica's fate. In the rearview mirror, he saw her standing on the sidewalk, mouth agape in shock, her partner approaching with a panicked expression, realizing their plan to enjoy a lavish inheritance had just turned into a legal and social nightmare. Richard also noticed another, more discreet figure, Helen. The housekeeper who had worked for the family for years was watching from the kitchen window. Her eyes met Richard's in the mirror, and she gave him an almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of complicity and relief that confirmed everything he had already suspected. The neighbors' curtains continued to twitch. The spectacle was over, but the whispers were just beginning. The car glided away from the mansion, leaving the scene of cruelty behind. Inside the vehicle, the silence was profound, broken only by the soft hum of the engine and Clara's trembling breaths. Richard glanced at her in the mirror. The girl remained huddled in the back seat, her eyes fixed on the photograph in her hands, as if the image of her sister were the only anchor in a world that had cast her adrift. He felt a wave of guilt and fury at himself. How could he have been so distant? How could he have trusted Veronica to care for his brother's daughters? He had been so focused on multiplying his net worth, on analyzing the rise and fall of stocks on Wall Street, on turning his capital into a billion-dollar empire, that he had forgotten the most important treasure his brother had left behind. That small child in the back seat was the most precious asset of all, and he had almost lost her. He drove through wide, tree-lined streets to the gates of his own sanctuary, a modernist mansion of glass and steel, perched on a hill with a view of the city. To Clara, the place was as vast and intimidating as a castle from an unknown fairy tale. Richard lifted her out of the car again. Her small feet barely touched the ground as he guided her through the entrance hall, a soaring space with a double-height ceiling and a glass wall that revealed the glittering city lights in the distance. "You're safe here, Clara," he said, his voice echoing softly in the silence. "This is your home now. No one will ever hurt you again." He carried her to one of the guest rooms, a cozy space with a large, soft bed and a floor-to-ceiling window. He helped her take off her shoes and laid her gently on the plush comforter. For a moment, she seemed to relax, her small eyes finally closing, exhausted from all the crying. Richard thought about leaving to let her rest, but as he turned toward the door, a fragile little voice called out, "Uncle Richard." He turned back. Clara was sitting up in bed, her eyes open again, shining with unshed tears and a doubt that seemed too heavy for her small body. She looked at him with a seriousness that broke his heart, and asked the question Veronica had planted in her mind like a poisonous seed. "Uncle, am I a burden?" Clara's question, "Uncle, am I a burden?" hit Richard harder than any stock market crash. This was the real loss, the invisible wound Veronica had inflicted on the child's soul. He knelt again beside the bed, his large, imposing frame trying to make itself smaller, less intimidating. He took her small hand, which was still clutching the photograph, and held it with a delicacy that contrasted with the force of his business dealings. His eyes, which could analyze complex financial statements and predict market fluctuations, now focused entirely on his niece's fragile face. "Clara, look at me," he said, his voice firm but filled with an emotion he rarely showed. "You never were, you are not, and you never will be a burden. You are a treasure. You and your sister are the most valuable part of the inheritance your father left me. You are family, and family is the only investment that always pays off, the only asset that truly matters. Do you understand?" Clara watched him in silence for a long moment, her eyes searching for the truth in his. Slowly, she nodded, an almost imperceptible movement. A single tear escaped and landed on his hand. Richard wiped it away with his thumb. "Now sleep. You're safe, I promise." He tucked the comforter around her, and exhaustion finally claimed her. She fell asleep almost instantly, her face serene for the first time on this terrible day. Laura's photo still held firmly in her hand. Richard watched her for a few minutes, his heart heavy with grief and fury. This room, once an impersonal space for guests, now had a purpose. It had a center. He left, closing the door with infinite care, and the gentleness on his face dissolved, replaced by a cold determination. He walked to his office, a sanctuary of glass and steel overlooking the city lights, a panorama that represented his wealth and power. But tonight, the lights seemed insignificant. He picked up the phone and dialed the number of his personal lawyer, a man known for being the most ruthless in the country. "Marcus, it's Richard. Cancel whatever you're doing. I have a job for you, the most important one. It's about my niece." On the other end of the line, there was no hesitation. Marcus knew that when Richard called in that tone, the matter was serious. Richard recounted the night's events concisely and brutally, leaving out no detail. "I want her out of Clara's life, completely. Use every resource. Veronica is interested in my brother's inheritance, the assets, the net worth. We'll use that. I want full custody of the girl, and I want you to run a forensic accounting of every cent she's spent since my brother's death. Every investment, every withdrawal. I don't care what it costs. My business cash flow can cover any expense. Just handle it." After hanging up, he made another call, this time to Helen, his assistant and head housekeeper, a middle-aged woman with a heart as big as her efficiency. He explained the situation and asked her to prepare everything for Clara's permanent arrival. Clothes, toys, a room that was hers, not a guest space. He wanted the girl to feel at home, not like she was in a luxury hotel. He sat back in his leather armchair, the phone still in his hand, and stared out at the city. All that money, all the assets he had accumulated, had felt hollow until this moment. Now, they had a purpose greater than just generating more dividends. They would be Clara's shield. They would be the weapon he would use to ensure her peace and happiness. He was ready for a battle, a war that wouldn't be fought on the stock exchange, but in courtrooms and the whispering corridors of high society. The peace he felt from having Clara safe was short-lived. The phone vibrated in his hand, displaying Marcus's name on the screen again. "Already?" Richard answered, surprised by the speed. "Richard, we have a problem." The lawyer's voice was urgent. "Veronica was faster than I thought. She just filed a report at the police precinct. She's accusing you of kidnapping." The word kidnapping echoed through the silent office, an accusation so absurd Richard almost laughed. But Marcus's tone was too serious for any humor. Veronica's move was bold, a desperate attempt to flip the narrative, to paint herself as the victim before the truth could take root. She was using the weapon she knew best: manipulation, performance. The scene of abandonment on the sidewalk would be, in her version, the misguided rescue by an unstable uncle. Richard felt his blood boil but forced himself to remain calm. Panic was for amateurs. He was a strategist. "She has no way to prove that, Marcus. There are witnesses, neighbors, the housekeeper. Witnesses she will try to discredit, Richard. She'll say you used your influence, your wealth, to coerce your staff. She'll say the neighbors only saw a fragment of the scene, and she has an ace up her sleeve, legally, until a judge decides otherwise. She is Clara's guardian. You took the child from her home. It's your word against hers, and for now, hers has the weight of the law. The police are probably on their way to your house right now." Richard looked through the glass wall, as if he could see the police cars winding their way up the hill. He wasn't afraid of them, but he felt a profound revulsion. They would invade his sanctuary, maybe wake Clara. The thought of disturbing the little peace the girl had found enraged him. What do we do? First, stay calm. You're not going to be arrested, but you need to cooperate. When they arrive, be polite. Explain your side of the story. I'm already on my way. Second, and most important, we need irrefutable proof. The word of Helen, the housekeeper, will be crucial, and we have to find anything that demonstrates Veronica's negligence, something that proves her intent was, in fact, abandonment. As Marcus spoke, a memory surfaced in Richard's mind, the small pink suitcase. It was too new, too neatly packed for a simple, last-minute change of scenery. It looked planned. Marcus, when Helen gets here tomorrow, ask her to bring everything she can from the girls' room. Everything Veronica hasn't thrown out. I want the clothes, the toys, any diaries, if they exist. I want to look for anything Laura might have left behind. They hung up, and Richard walked slowly to Clara's room. He opened the door a crack. The girl was sleeping soundly, her face peaceful, clutching the photograph. She was safe, for now. The distant sound of sirens began to climb the hill, a foreboding wail drawing closer. Richard closed the door, his resolve harder than the concrete of his house. He would face them. 20 minutes later, red and blue lights flashed against the windows, staining the white walls of his living room. 2 police officers, one older and weary, the other young and tense, stood in his entrance hall, accompanied by Veronica's lawyer, a slick-looking man. Richard greeted them with disarming calm. "Good evening, officers. How can I help you?" The older officer explained the accusation, reading from Veronica's complaint in a monotone voice. Richard listened patiently. "Mrs. Veronica alleges that you, in a state of severe emotional distress, took the child by force, believing she was not being well cared for. She is very concerned for her stepdaughter's well-being." "Concerned," Richard repeated, the irony sharp as a knife. "Her concern was so great that she put her on the sidewalk with a suitcase and told her she didn't want her in the house anymore. I didn't kidnap her. I rescued her." Veronica's lawyer interjected. "That is a slanderous accusation. My client merely arranged for the girl to spend some time with friends, to ease the atmosphere of mourning. You misinterpreted the situation, sir." The argument continued for nearly an hour. Marcus arrived and took over, his precise legal language dismantling the fragile allegations. In the end, the officers, realizing this was a complex family dispute and not a clear-cut crime, decided not to take any immediate action, leaving the matter to be resolved in the courts. They left, leaving a tense silence behind. When everyone was gone, Marcus turned to Richard. "We won the first skirmish, but the war is just beginning. She will use everything she can. She'll claim you're unstable, that your business life makes you an absent guardian. We need something strong, something that will destroy her completely." Richard nodded, his thoughts returning to the small pink suitcase and what might be hidden in the room Clara had been forced to abandon. Amidst all the pain, he hoped that Laura, somehow, had left behind a clue, a final message to protect her sister. The key to Clara's freedom wasn't in his vast net worth, but perhaps in a simple piece of paper hidden in a toy box. The next morning broke grey and silent. Richard hadn't slept, having spent the night in his office, not in front of stock market charts or reports on the profitability of his investment funds, but with a single blank sheet of paper before him. On it, he was mapping out a strategy, not to acquire a new company or grow his capital, but to protect a life. Every move Veronica made was a liability he had to anticipate. The kidnapping accusation was her opening bid, an aggressive play to destabilize him. He, however, was used to volatile markets and ruthless adversaries. The difference was that this time, the asset he was protecting was priceless. Upstairs, Clara woke up in a room that wasn't hers. For a moment, panic seized her, the feeling of abandonment from the night before rushing back. But then she saw the soft light filtering through the window, the comfortable armchair in the corner, and on it, new clothes that someone had left for her. She remembered her uncle's strong arms, his promise. It wasn't her room, but it was safe. In the morning, Helen arrived, and her presence was like a balm to Clara's wounded soul. The kind-faced, work-worn housekeeper hugged her with a maternal warmth the girl hadn't felt in a long time, and Clara allowed herself to cry on her shoulder. Helen had brought 3 cardboard boxes with her, all she could salvage from the twins' room, before Veronica gave orders for everything to be donated, erased. "She was in a hurry, Mr. Richard," Helen said in a low voice, while Clara was distracted with a glass of milk in the kitchen. "Ever since the funeral, all she talks about is selling off some assets, about how the inheritance needs to be settled quickly so she can start over. She and that man, they look at the house, the furniture, like they're just numbers on a spreadsheet." Helen's words were the ammunition Richard needed. Veronica wasn't grieving. She was liquidating the past. After Clara finished her breakfast, Richard called her into the living room, where the boxes were laid out on the soft rug. "Clara, I had an idea," he said carefully. "What if we made a special little corner here in the house, just for Laura? A place where we can keep her favorite things, so she'll always be close to us." The girl's eyes lit up with a spark of interest, the first he had seen since the tragedy. She nodded shyly. Together, the 3 of them began to unpack the boxes. It was a painful, bittersweet task. Every folded dress, every porcelain doll, every dog-eared book was a memory. Clara told stories about each object, her voice sometimes faltering, but Richard listened with infinite patience. They set aside Laura's treasures: a teddy bear worn nearly bald from hugs, a collection of shiny rocks, a diary with only a few pages filled. Amidst a pile of art supplies, Clara picked up an old shoebox decorated with star and heart stickers. "Laura's secret box," she whispered, running her fingers over the lid. "No one was allowed to touch it, only me." With ceremonial gentleness, she opened the box. Inside were dozens of drawings. Most depicted the 2 sisters, hand in hand, smiling under a bright yellow sun. At the bottom, there was a folded piece of paper. Clara picked it up and handed it to her uncle. It was a note, written in round, slightly crooked letters. "We promise to never be apart." Richard's heart tightened. That innocent promise had been broken in the cruelest way. It was proof of the bond between the sisters, but perhaps not enough for a judge. He was about to put the note aside when Helen, who was organizing the drawings, frowned. "Sir, look at this." She handed him one of the drawings from the bottom of the box. It was different from the others. In it, 2 little girls stood on one side, crying. On the other side, a tall woman with blonde hair and a black dress was pointing toward the door. And in the corner of the paper, in red crayon, Laura had written a single sentence. Richard read the words and felt the floor drop out from under him. This changed everything. It was no longer his word against Veronica's. It was Laura's word, reaching from beyond the silence to protect her sister. The yellow drawing paper seemed to weigh a ton in Richard's hands. The childish lines, the vibrant colors, and the scene depicted formed a brutal contrast with the sentence written in red in the corner. In hesitant capital letters, Laura's handwriting decreed the truth Veronica had tried to hide beneath layers of feigned grief and cruel excuses. "Aunt V said there's only room for one." The air left Richard's lungs in a hiss. It wasn't a tantrum, not a fantasy. It was a testimony, proof of a calculated cruelty, whispered in the corners of that mansion long before Laura had even gotten sick. Seeing the drawing, Clara froze. Her eyes widened, and the memory of that day flooded back like a cold wave. She remembered it was on a rainy afternoon, a few weeks before everything happened. Veronica was on the phone, speaking quietly but angrily. She was talking about expenses, about the future, about how her father's estate was vast, but that 2 mouths to feed was a burden she hadn't anticipated. Laura had overheard and in silence went to her room to draw her fear. She had shown the drawing to Clara later, and the two had hugged, making their promise never to be apart, a childish pact against a threat they barely understood. She already wanted, Clara whispered, her voice choked. She already wanted one of us to go away. This was the turning point. The story was no longer about a grief-stricken stepmother who had made a terrible decision in a moment of weakness. It was about a woman who saw her stepdaughters as an impediment to her wealth, an obstacle between her and the inheritance she coveted. Clara's expulsion had not been an impulsive act. It was the conclusion of a plan. Richard felt a cold fury settle over him, a sharp clarity that overrode all emotion. He now understood Veronica's haste to donate the toys, to erase the traces. She wasn't cleaning house, she was destroying evidence. With the drawing in hand, he returned to his office. Helen stayed with Clara, wrapping her in a protective embrace. Trying to soothe the tremors the drawing had awakened, Richard photographed the paper with his phone and sent the image to Marcus with a single message. "Call me, now." The phone rang seconds later. "Richard, what is this?" The lawyer's voice was tense. "It's our case, Marcus. It's the truth. Laura drew this weeks before she passed away." There was a silence on the other end of the line, the sound of a seasoned lawyer processing the weight of this evidence. It wasn't material proof in the traditional sense, but its emotional impact on any judge would be devastating. It was the voice of a child revealing an environment of psychological abuse. "Richard, this changes everything," Marcus said, his voice now filled with a contained energy. "Forget defense. We go on the attack. We file for an emergency custody order, attaching this as proof that Veronica is a danger to Clara's psychological well-being. We'll allege the abandonment was premeditated. She will have no defense against this. The strategy was set. The war of narratives was over. Now they had a fact, drawn on paper and signed with the innocence of a child." Richard felt an immense relief, but the fury still bubbled beneath the surface. He wanted to confront her, to throw that drawing in her face and watch her crumble. "Prepare the paperwork, Marcus. I want her served as soon as possible. They'll be ready by morning, but Richard," Marcus paused, "I have a suggestion. Let's not lead with the custody motion. That will give her time to react, to hide assets, to manipulate the situation. Let's hit her where it really hurts." Richard frowned. "What do you mean?" "Veronica did all of this for one reason. The money, your brother's fortune. Before we serve her with the custody papers, we strike the first blow against her access to the estate. Tomorrow, a process server will deliver an immediate court order, freezing all assets. We're going to prohibit her from selling, transferring, or liquidating anything from the inheritance. We're going to take away the only thing she truly loves." The next morning unfolded under a clear blue sky, a cruel irony given the storm that was about to break over Veronica. As she sipped her coffee from a fine china cup, planning a trip to Europe with her partner, an early celebration of the freedom and fortune she believed was within her grasp, a discreet sedan pulled up in front of the mansion. A man in a grey suit, carrying a leather briefcase, rang the doorbell. Veronica, annoyed by the interruption, opened the door with a look of disdain that dissolved the moment he introduced himself as a process server and handed her the documents. Her hands trembled as she read the legal jargon. The words asset freeze, injunction against sale of property, and forensic accounting investigation leaped off the page like vipers. The coffee, the plans, the luxurious future, it all dissolved into an icy panic. Her partner, reading the document over her shoulder, turned pale. The foundation of their transactional relationship had just crumbled. The wealth he so coveted was suddenly locked in a vault to which he had no key. The reaction was immediate and vicious, not physically, but in poisonous accusations. "I told you that you should have been more careful," he hissed, the false charm vanishing to reveal the greedy opportunist beneath. "You've ruined everything." At Richard's mansion, the atmosphere was different. He and Clara spent the morning setting up Laura's corner in a sunny nook of the living room. They placed the shiny rocks on a shelf, the teddy bear in a small armchair, and in a silver frame. The note with the sister's promise. Clara, for the first time, smiled, a small, fragile but genuine smile. She felt safe, and the memory of her sister was no longer just a source of pain, but also of comfort. The drawing, the devastating proof, was secured in a safe, waiting for the right moment to be used in court. Richard watched his niece, and every one of her smiles strengthened his resolve. He wasn't just fighting for custody. He was fighting for her right to have a childhood, to heal in an environment of love and security. Marcus called in the early afternoon. "She took the bait. Veronica is in a full-blown panic. She called me, screaming, making threats, and just as I predicted, she made a mistake. A big one." "What was it?" Richard asked, stepping away so Clara wouldn't hear. "She tried to wire a significant amount of money from one of the joint estate accounts to a personal account in her partner's name, minutes after being served. A direct violation of the court order. Our monitoring system caught it instantly. Richard, she just committed a felony. This isn't about custody anymore. It's about fraud. She's finished." The news didn't bring Richard the satisfaction he expected, just a deep weariness. Veronica's greed was a bottomless pit, and she was drowning in it, pulling everything down with her. He thought of Clara, of the purity of her grief, and compared it to the sordidness of Veronica's motives. The battle was nearly won, but at what cost? The girl would have to endure a legal process, perhaps even testify. He wanted to spare her that at all costs. That night, as he was tucking Clara into bed, she turned to him, her eyes large and serious. "Uncle Richard, are we going to have to go to that place where the grown-ups fight with the man in the black robe?" She meant a judge. The fear in her voice was palpable. Richard sat on the edge of the bed and took her hand. "I'm going to do everything I can so you won't have to, sweetie. But if you do, I'll be right beside you, holding your hand the whole time, and you'll only have to tell the truth. The truth is the strongest thing in the world." Clara seemed to take comfort in that. She fell asleep holding his hand. Richard stayed there for a long time, watching her. He knew that Veronica, cornered, would become even more dangerous. She had nothing left to lose, and people like that were capable of anything. He feared that in her desperation she might try something unthinkable, to find Clara, to manipulate or scare her before the hearing. The sanctuary he had built for his niece felt secure, but he knew that malice, sometimes, finds a way to seep through the cracks. The days that followed were a fragile calm, like the thin glass of a bell jar Richard was trying to build around Clara. He cancelled all his business trips and began managing his vast financial empire from his home office. For him, a man accustomed to thinking in terms of profitability and capital growth, the greatest wealth became the sound of Clara's hesitant laughter echoing through the halls. He would listen to it while negotiating the acquisition of a new tech startup over the phone or discussing cryptocurrency volatility with his investment manager. These deals, which once consumed his existence, now seemed like distant background noise. The real profit was right there, in the next room, in the form of a little girl who was starting to trust again. They established a routine: breakfast on the terrace, reading in the garden, and late in the afternoon, a moment in Laura's corner, where Clara would tell a story to the teddy bear. Slowly, the shadow in her eyes began to lift, replaced by a glint of childish curiosity. Helen, with her constant, affectionate presence, was the anchor of this new normal, preparing Clara's favorite foods and ensuring the house was a haven of peace. It was on one of these quiet afternoons, as Clara was drawing on the living room rug, that the glass jar cracked. The sharp buzz of the main intercom, the one connecting the gatehouse to the mansion, cut through the silence. Richard answered, his voice calm. "Yes, Alfonso." "Mr. Richard," the security guard's voice was tense. "Mrs. Veronica is here at the front gate. She's demanding to see the girl. Says it's her right." Richard's blood ran cold. His first reaction was a violent impulse, a desire to go down the hill and physically remove the woman. But he looked at Clara, completely absorbed in her drawing of a sun with a smiling face, and the fury morphed into a protective resolve. "Do not let her in under any circumstances, Alfonso. Tell her to contact her lawyer. If she refuses to leave, call the police." "Yes, sir." "But she's making a scene." Richard knew he had to contain the situation before it turned into a spectacle that might somehow reach Clara. "Helen," he called, his voice low and urgent, "take Clara to the music room at the back of the house. Put on the music she likes, very loud. Don't let her leave for any reason." Helen understood immediately. With a gentle smile, she approached the girl. "Clara, sweetie, how about you show me how to play that song on the piano?" As Clara was led away, oblivious to the storm brewing at the gates of her sanctuary, Richard went to the video intercom panel in his office. He pressed the button, and Veronica's face appeared on the screen, distorted by rage and desperation. She no longer looked like the elegant socialite, but a woman undone, her hair in disarray, her eyes red from crying or from fury. "Richard, let me see my daughter." "You can't do this," she screamed at the camera. "She is not your daughter, Veronica, and you lost any right to her when you threw her out on the street." His voice was a block of ice. "Go home. Settle this in court." "Court? You think you can scare me with your lawyers and your dirty money? You stole that girl from me. You're poisoning her mind against me. She loves me." Richard remained silent, letting her exhaust her rage. Seeing that her screaming had no effect, her tone changed, becoming slick, venomous. "You tell her, Richard. Tell her that her sister felt the same way. That Laura thought I was a monster in the end too. Tell Clara it's her fault. It was her crying, her neediness, that made Laura so sad she didn't want to fight anymore. It was a low blow, a lie calculated to inflict the greatest possible pain." Richard felt the air leave his lungs, the cruelty of those words hitting him physically. He cut the communication abruptly, the screen going black. He turned, his heart pounding, his breath caught in his throat. And then he saw her, standing in the hallway, pale as a ghost, was Clara. She must have slipped away from Helen, perhaps drawn by the raised voices. Her eyes, enormous and filled with an unspeakable horror, were fixed on him. She had heard every word. Time seemed to stall in that hallway. Clara's face was a small waxen mask, devoid of color, her eyes mirroring an abyss of pain Richard never imagined possible. Veronica's cruel lie, hurled like a rock through the intercom, had shattered the fragile world he was trying to rebuild for her. He took a step toward her, arms outstretched, but the girl flinched back, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but one that hit him like a physical barrier. The sound of children's music, which Helen had turned up to full volume, still drifted from the back room, a bizarre soundtrack to the unfolding tragedy. "Clara, sweetie, what you heard, it's not true. It's a lie, a horrible lie from a very wicked woman." His voice was a hoarse, desperate whisper, but the words seemed to dissolve before they could reach her. Clara didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply turned and walked silently to her room, her small shoulders rigid. Richard followed, his heart hammering against his ribs. He watched her climb onto the bed and curl up under the comforter, turning her face to the wall. She said nothing. The silence that fell was heavier and more frightening than any sob. Helen appeared in the hallway, her face worried. "Sir, what happened?" "She heard," Richard said, his voice breaking. "She heard Veronica." The next few hours were the longest of Richard's life. Clara refused to leave her room, refused food, refused to speak. Richard sat in an armchair outside her door, feeling more powerless than he ever had. What good was all his fortune, his entire estate built on years of hard work and smart investments? He could move markets, buy companies, amass a seemingly infinite wealth, but he couldn't get through a wooden door to reach the wounded heart of a child. Veronica's poisonous seed had found fertile ground in the survivor's guilt Clara already carried. And now it was taking deep, terrible root. The next day, the situation hadn't improved. Clara emerged from her room, but it was as if a part of her had been left behind. She moved through the house like a small shadow, her eyes vacant. She didn't touch her colored pencils. She didn't ask for stories, and most painfully, she didn't go near Laura's corner. The space that had once been a sanctuary of memory and comfort now seemed like an accusation. Richard watched her from a distance, his chest tight with anguish. He called Marcus, his voice filled with a cold fury. She got to the girl, Marcus. She poisoned her with horrible lies. I want a restraining order. I want her legally barred from coming within a mile of this house, from making any contact whatsoever. Use whatever it takes. But he knew legal measures were like locking the barn door after the horse had bolted. The damage was done, and it was internal. Desperate, searching for anything that could break the spell of those cruel words, Richard remembered Laura's diary, the small, pink-covered notebook they had found in the secret box. Maybe there, in her sister's own handwriting, Clara could find the truth. He retrieved the diary from the safe, where he kept the drawing, and took it to his office. The pages were few, filled with the simple thoughts of an 8-year-old, an account of a picnic in the park, a list of her favorite candies, a drawing of a puppy she dreamed of having. Richard leafed through the pages with reverent care, feeling like an intruder in his niece's secret world. Every doodle, every crooked word was a small gem from an interrupted life, a treasure more precious than all the gold and Bitcoin held in his investment accounts. He was searching for an answer, a clue, anything he could use as an antidote to Veronica's venom, but all he found was innocence. The joy of getting a new doll, the sadness of scraping a knee, and on almost every page a constant Clara's name. Today, Clara and I built a blanket fort. Clara told me a ghost story and I couldn't sleep. I love Clara more than chocolate ice cream. The love between them was the spine of the little diary, the golden thread that stitched all the memories together. But would it be enough? He kept turning the pages, and the tone began to subtly shift. The entries grew shorter. There were mentions of a headache and staying in bed all day. On one page, there was just a drawing of a girl lying down, surrounded by grey scribbles. Richard's heart contracted. He was witnessing, in silence, the slow dimming of that little flame. Guilt hit him again. Where had he been while all this was happening? Probably on another continent, closing some multi-million-dollar deal, accumulating assets that now seemed utterly useless. He was reaching the end of the diary, his hope fading. Maybe there was nothing there. Maybe Veronica's evil would win. And then he saw it. On the second-to-last page, dated just days before Laura was hospitalized for the final time, the handwriting was weaker, more shaky, but the words were clear. Richard leaned in to read, his breath caught in his throat. Aunt V was fighting on the phone again today. Said taking care of 2 of us is too expensive. Then she looked at me and Clara and made a mean face. Clara started to cry a little, scared. I hugged her really tight. Clara's crying doesn't make me sad. Her hug makes the pain in my head go away for a little while. I wish I could get better soon so we could run away and build our own house. I promised her in the note that we would never be apart, and I'm going to keep it. Richard reread the passage 2-3 times. The truth was there, crystal clear. It wasn't Clara's crying that saddened Laura. It was her comfort. It was her hug that gave her strength. Laura didn't feel burdened by her sister. She felt like her protector. With trembling hands, Richard closed the diary. He had the weapon he needed. Not for the court, not for Marcus, but for the most important battle of all, the one being waged in Clara's silent heart. He stood and went to her room. The door was ajar. Clara was sitting on the floor, her back to the door, facing Laura's corner. She wasn't playing. She was just staring, motionless, at her sister's things. Richard entered slowly, so as not to startle her. He sat on the rug, a respectful distance away. "Clara," he said softly, "can I read something to you? It's from Laura's diary." She didn't turn, didn't answer. She just kept looking at the teddy bear in the little armchair. Richard took a deep breath. He opened the diary to a random, happy page. "Today, Clara taught me how to make a daisy chain. Mine came out all crooked, but she said it was the most beautiful one in the world." He paused. He saw Clara's shoulders tense slightly. He turned to another page. "Clara's birthday cake had a giant strawberry on it. I let her eat my piece too. She was so happy she gave me the biggest hug ever." He continued, reading the happy memories, weaving a net of love and companionship around the silent girl. Slowly, very slowly, she turned her head. Her eyes, still dull with pain, met his. It was the signal he had been waiting for. With his heart in his throat, he turned to the last page he'd read, and, his voice thick with emotion, read the words that could either save his niece or break her heart for good. "Her hug makes the pain in my head go away for a little while. I promised her in the note that we would never be apart. And I'm going to keep it." Laura's final words, read in Richard's choked voice, hung in the air of the room, suspended between past and present. They weren't just words. They were an embrace reaching across time, a light trying to pierce the darkness that had swallowed Clara. The girl remained motionless for a long, torturous second. Inside her small head, a fierce battle was being waged. On one side, Veronica's hissing voice, full of venom, repeating the cruel lie, "It's your fault." On the other, her sister's shaky handwriting, a soft and powerful truth. "Her hug makes the pain go away." Two opposing forces, hatred and love, were fighting for possession of her wounded soul. Richard didn't dare breathe. His entire empire, his businesses, his fortune in dollars and euros, his net worth that placed him among the richest men in the country, all of it was meaningless. He was a billionaire, held hostage by the silence of an 8-year-old girl, waiting for a verdict that no amount of money could buy. Then, a tremor ran through Clara's tiny body. A single, dry, painful sob escaped her lips. One tear, then another, and another began to stream down her pale face, carving silent paths in her skin. These weren't the tears of fear or sadness Richard had seen before. They were tears of liberation. Veronica's lie, like a dam of filth, had just broken under the force of Laura's unwavering love. The truth, held back for so long, came rushing out in a torrent. The silence shattered. Clara collapsed into a deep, wailing cry, a lament that came from the depths of her being, releasing weeks of pent-up pain, undeserved guilt, and overwhelming loss. Richard finally moved. He crawled across the rug and wrapped her in his arms. And this time, she didn't pull away. She clung to him, her face buried in his chest, her small fists clenched against his shirt as the waves of grief shook her. He held her tightly, rocking her gently, whispering words of comfort. "It's okay, my love. Let it all out. I'm here. Laura is here." He felt her tears soaking his shirt and realized this was the true profit of his entire life, the only dividend that truly mattered. It wasn't the compound interest on his financial assets, but the mending of a broken heart. The return on this moment was infinite. After a long time, Clara's crying subsided into calmer sobs. She pulled back a little, her face puffy and red, but her eyes, for the first time in days, were clear. She reached out her small, trembling hand, not for Richard, but for the diary he still held. "Can I see?" she whispered. He handed her the small notebook. With the tip of her finger, she traced the letters her sister had written. Her hug, makes the pain go away. A tiny smile, the first in an eternity, touched her lips. She believed it. She finally believed. Richard pulled her onto his lap, the weight of the girl feeling like the most precious thing in the world. He hugged her and kissed the top of her head, feeling a peace that no successful Wall Street trade had ever given him. The worst was over. Clara's internal battle had been won. As he was soothing her, he felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. Reluctantly, he pulled it out, trying not to disturb the moment. It was a text from Marcus. His eyes scanned the screen, and the peace he felt evaporated, replaced by a cold alarm. The message was short and direct, but every word was an imminent threat. Custody hearing scheduled. Tomorrow morning. Veronica filed an emergency motion. She is demanding the right to have a private conversation with Clara alone before entering the judge's chambers. Marcus's text was a gut punch. Veronica's demand for a private talk with Clara was a masterstroke of cruelty. It was one last attempt to terrorize the star witness, to plant seeds of doubt and fear before the girl could speak. Richard's protective instinct screamed at him to refuse, to build a fortress around Clara and keep her far from that toxic influence. He picked up his phone, ready to order Marcus to deny the request with the full force of the law. But as he looked down at his niece, now asleep on his lap, her face serene with tear tracks dried on her cheeks, he hesitated. Wouldn't locking her away, overprotecting her, also be a way of disempowering her, of treating her like a fragile object in a fight between adults? He knew, with painful clarity, that the final decision couldn't be his. It had to be hers. The next morning, the air in the mansion was thick with a quiet tension. Richard explained the situation to Clara with a simplicity and honesty that treated her not as a victim, but as the most important person in the room. "Clara, Veronica is going to be at the courthouse, and she has asked to speak with you for 1 minute before we talk to the judge. You do not have to do this. If you say no, I won't let her anywhere near you. But I wanted you to know that the choice is yours." Clara was silent for a moment, her fingers tightening on the cover of Laura's diary, which she now carried everywhere, along with the small, framed photograph. Her eyes met her uncle's, and in them there was no fear, only a calm determination that seemed far older than her 8 years. "I want to talk to her," she said, her voice low but firm. "Laura would want me to." The courthouse corridor was a cold, impersonal place, with polished wooden benches and a smell of disinfectant and anxiety. Richard held Clara's hand, feeling how small and cool it was in his own. Across the hall, Veronica and her partner waited. The stepmother tried to compose a mask of concern and relief, but her hard, calculating eyes betrayed the charade. Richard felt Clara squeeze his hand, a small gesture that conveyed not fear, but a strange, new strength. After a brief, tense negotiation between the lawyers, the conversation was permitted in a small adjoining room, its frosted glass doors allowing the adults to see silhouettes, but not hear words. Richard knelt in front of Clara. "Remember what Laura wrote. That's your truth," he whispered. Clara nodded, took a deep breath, and walked into the room. Veronica closed the door behind them. Richard stood outside, his heart pounding like a hammer, feeling more tense than during any multi-million-dollar negotiation he had ever made. These few minutes were the riskiest investment of his life. Inside the room, Veronica dropped the sweet facade. She crouched down, her voice a venomous hiss. "Listen to me very carefully, Clara. You are going to go in there and tell the judge that you miss me. You will say that your uncle is confusing you, filling your head with lies. If you don't, you will be sorry. No one will want a girl who causes so much trouble. You'll end up all alone." Clara listened in silence, her face impassive. She didn't flinch, didn't cry. Instead, she held up the small frame photograph of herself and Laura, placing it in the space between them. Laura never lied, Clara said, her voice surprisingly clear and steady. And I'm not going to lie either. Then she opened the small pink diary to the bookmarked page and turned it toward Veronica, pointing a small finger at her sister's shaky handwriting. She wrote that my hug made her pain go away. You said my crying made her give up. You're the liar. You didn't like us. You only liked Daddy's money. Veronica's face twisted into a mask of fury. The truth, spoken so simply and directly, had utterly disarmed her. She opened her mouth to retaliate, but the door opened. It was time. Clara turned without a backward glance and walked into Richard's arms, leaving Veronica frozen, the color draining from her face. She had lost in the judge's chambers before a woman with graying hair and sharp, perceptive eyes. The hearing was brief. Marcus presented the case methodically, outlining the abandonment, Helen's testimony, the asset freeze, and the attempted fraud. Finally, he submitted Laura's drawing and the diary as the final exhibits of premeditated emotional abuse. The judge read the passages from the diary, her face hardening with every word. Then she turned to Clara with a gentle voice. "Clara, dear, is there anything you would like to tell me?" Clara, sitting beside Richard, stood up. With a dignity that seemed impossible for her age, she walked to the judge's desk and placed the photograph and the diary on the polished wood. "My sister promised we would never be apart, and Veronica separated us," she said, her voice firm. "But she can't hurt me with lies anymore. I know the truth now. I want to stay with my Uncle Richard." It was all she needed to say. The judge looked from Clara to Veronica, whose face was a ruin of shattered arrogance. The decision was immediate and final. Full and permanent custody of Clara is hereby granted to her uncle, Richard. A permanent restraining order is issued, prohibiting Mrs. Veronica from any and all contact with the minor. Furthermore, I am ordering a full audit of the entire management of the deceased's estate and inheritance. This court does not tolerate cruelty, especially when motivated by greed. Case closed. The sound of the gavel echoed in the room. Veronica made a strangled sound. Her partner, seeing the empire of wealth turn to dust and criminal investigations, stood, shot her a look of pure contempt, and walked out of the room without a word, abandoning her to her own destruction. The conflict was over. Richard lifted Clara into his arms, and together they walked out of the cold courtroom and into the sunlight. The drive back from the courthouse was spent in a silence that, for the first time, was not heavy or painful, but serene and peaceful. The morning sun streamed through the car windows, the light dancing on Clara's face as she watched the city go by, not with frightened eyes, but with a new curiosity. On her lap, she held Laura's diary and the small photograph, no longer as crutches to endure pain, but as treasures that held the strength of her story. Richard watched her out of the corner of his eye, and the knot of anxiety that had been lodged in his chest for weeks finally unraveled. He hadn't just won a legal battle. He had witnessed the rebirth of courage in his niece's heart. His entire vast estate, his assets scattered across the globe, seemed insignificant compared to the value of the small hand that suddenly reached for his and held it tight. In that simple touch, he understood the true definition of wealth. When they arrived at the mansion gates, Helen was waiting at the front door, her face etched with worry. The moment she saw Clara get out of the car, no longer a shadow but with her head held high, the tears Helen had been holding back spilled over in relief and joy. She enveloped the girl in a warm hug, and for the first time, Clara laughed, a crystal-clear sound that echoed through the entrance hall and filled the house with life. This was no longer the sanctuary of a solitary multimillionaire. It was a home. The following days cemented this new reality. Richard postponed meetings about assets and new ventures to spend afternoons in the garden with Clara, teaching her how to plant flowers. He discovered that the sound of her laughter was more valuable than the ringing of the stock exchange bell announcing profits. A week later, Marcus called. The news about Veronica was predictable but definitive. The audit had uncovered a systematic scheme to embezzle funds from the estate, starting long before Laura's death. She and her former partner would face criminal charges for fraud and misappropriation. With all her assets frozen and her reputation in ruins, she had lost everything she had ever coveted. Her regret was not of the soul, but of the gambler who had bet everything and lost spectacularly. For Richard and Clara, she became just a distant memory, a shadow that could no longer reach them. That evening, Richard found Clara sitting in Laura's corner. She had added something new. Next to the photo of the two sisters was a drawing she had made. It depicted three figures holding hands under a smiling sun, a little girl with brown hair, an angel with wings just above her, and a tall, strong man beside her. She saw him in the doorway and smiled. "Now we're all together again," she said, with the profound simplicity of a child. Richard knelt beside her, his heart overflowing with an emotion for which he had no name. He looked at the drawing, at the memory of his brother, at the angel of Laura, and at the promise of the future that was Clara. He thought of his life before, a relentless pursuit of more money, more power, more capital. Now he understood. The greatest inheritance his brother had left him was not in stocks or bank accounts, but in this little girl who had taught him to redefine what it meant to be truly rich. He hugged her, smelling her hair and feeling the warmth of her trust. The portrait of the two sisters remained, a pillar of the past. But it now looked out onto a promising future, and a new promise was made, this time aloud and clear, so there would never be any doubt again. "From this day on, you will never be left behind again."